Great. Well, hi, everyone. It's wonderful to be here again. My name is Jim Hewitt. I'm a professor of education at the University of Toronto, and I'm one of your co-presenters. The other co-presenter is Nidhi Sachdeva, who's also a professor at the University of Toronto. We do a lot of work together, research together. We often co-teach courses on the science of learning in both pre-service and graduate education. So we're both very happy to be here again. And it's great to see you all.
All right, so yes, somebody said in the chat, this is our last session. That is true story, but hopefully we'll have more book studies and other reasons to meet. But coming back to this book, the book study we've been looking at is entitled How Learning Happens, Seminal Works in Educational Psychology and What They Mean in Practice, written by Paul A. Kirschner and Carl Hendrick, and a really, really great resource that we've always said in this book study as well. And I just actually received my copy of the second edition this morning, and I couldn't be happier. So it's a perfect opportunity. Yes, Jim's got one too. And it's a moment of bragging. My name's in the acknowledgements. I'm so excited. So thank you. Thanks to Paul and Carl. So, all right. So this is, again, so far we've covered a lot in this book study and a number of topics, some really important topics. Of course, the whole book we weren't able to do, but some really important topics. We began with the information processing model and cognitive load theory. Then we explored the role of prior knowledge and depth of processing. We looked at spacing, retrieval practice, and interleaving in session 4. And then last week, which just passed, we looked at dual coding theory. And today's session is very special. We are going to examine Rosenshine's principles of instruction, which are also called direct instruction or often referred to as explicit instruction. So we're going to unpack that in today's session. Our agenda here, you can see, so of course, a real quick review is in order for our last session on dual coding theory, some multimedia principles, and also the myth of learning styles, which made last session a very, very hot session, I have to say. It was really exciting to have all that amazing discussion. And then we're going to look at the key themes for our session today, which is, of course, direct instruction. And you'll notice that I've made an attempt to write it with lower D and lower I, the whole story around that. And basically, those are the principles of instruction that Rosenshine has so beautifully put together for us. And I always say, he couldn't have said it in any other easier words for us to understand as educators. We're also going to look at this notion of active learning, what it is and what it isn't, and some of the examples and non-examples of it. And my personal favorite, and also Jim's real favorite, is the story of Project Follow Through. Some of you may already know it. It may be absolute new and come as a shock to you, but I think it's so important. And I am really glad that we're going to finish off this particular book study with Project Follow Through. And we'll conclude the book study today. So here we are. Okay. So like always, let's do a real quick recap on what we did last time. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and share the retrieval practice for today. Okay, so I'm going to end the poll now and share results so we can see, and we can quickly go over the questions. All right. So you see the results in front of you, right? So our first question is, dual coding theory suggests that we have two different channels for processing information, one for words and one for, and the answer is images. So it's logogens, the text that includes words, the verbal stuff, and even the text that we hear is not auditory, but it's all the verbal stuff. And then, of course, images. And I think in images, it's not just the visuals, but sometimes even things like sounds and smells and stuff. So there's a lot going on in those channels. So it's really fascinating. Question number 2, which of the following is not predicted by dual coding theory? And the second option is the right one. Some people are verbal thinkers and some are image thinkers. That's not predictable. And that kind of goes into the category of, styles and all that kind of stuff, right? Question number 3, the modality principle. Yeah, it can be tricky and gets confusing sometimes. So the correct answer is folks learn best with visuals and the audio, the narrated text, right? And that's what the modality principle is. And I know it seemed like a bit of a trick question, and there was the option, all of the combinations are effective. Jim, I'm right about that? It's the visuals
Correct.
and narrated text, yeah. And I think I did mention last time that the little trick here is, and sort of a bit of an exception to modality principle can be sometimes if the narrated text has really, really complex words that may not be a part of our everyday vocabulary. In that case, it's nice to have those words as printed words on the screen also, but often it's just the visual and the narration works best according to the modality principle. And last but not the least, and this is where we have 100% correct answer right here, is that researchers have conducted numerous experiments to see if students perform better when the method of instruction matches their preferred learning style. They have discovered no evidence. So option 3 is the right one. So thank you for participating. And you can see it's it's just nice to be able to do a quick retrieval and recap of things and to see where we're at and trying to apply as much as possible in content creation and sharing of the content and disseminating knowledge. Okay, let's go back to my screen. And so thanks again for participating in the retrieval practice. So let's talk about today's session, which is direct instruction. So one of the challenges with this phrase direct instruction, if we say with uppercase, lowercase, doesn't matter in this context, right, this moment, is that you'll often hear it described in different ways in the media and even in the research literature, which adds to further confusion. There are a lot of different ideas about what direct instruction is and what it isn't, right? Some of these things are accurate, but some are wrong. So for example, I've sometimes heard people say that direct instruction is used for teaching rote learning. That's absolute misconception, and it's really popular, unfortunately, out there, right? So Jim and I thought we should begin this particular unit by by talking about what direct instruction is and what it isn't, okay? So what we have done here is a quick sort of collaborative, sharing on a tool called Padlet. Perhaps we've used this in session before. It's a really great environment where I'll just share the link in a second with you all in the chat, and you'll all be able to just click on the little plus sign at the bottom. I'll show you, and then you can share. So what we want to do is, what comes to your mind when you hear the words direct instruction? How is it popularly interpreted, right? So as I said, I've created a Padlet where we can share some of these ideas. I'm going to put that link in the chat in a second, and you click on it, and then you can start participating. So just give me 1 second. And it's right here, actually. You probably still see it. All right. Oh, thank you, Jim. You beat me to it. There, 2 times. All right. So if you click on the link, and you can still see my screen, you see a little plus sign at the bottom right. You'll click on that plus sign, and then you can just start adding what you'd like to say about what are some of the ways used to describe the phrase direct instruction. Once you're done, click on the button publish, and then you'll start seeing. I can see folks typing in, so I'll keep that particular screen there. Gradual release, chalk and talk. It's my favorite podcast. Explicit instruction, teacher-led lecturing, explicit instruction. Just checking, Jim, you're seeing the Padlet on the screen, right? Sometimes I'm confused which screen. Okay, good. There's a couple of screens happening here. Good, perfect. Modeling, I do, we do, you do. I love that. Clear, efficient. Clear explanation combined with opportunities for student practice and checking for understanding. Passive instruction, error feedback, corrective feedback. Direct instruction is a general approach of teaching based on a lot of checking, understanding, making explicit instruction. Differs from the uppercase DI, yes. Learning to mastery before moving on. Active engagement of students responding to teacher questions, scaffolded, boring, success-oriented. Great, small group teacher-led instruction. Right, yeah, these are really great. Yeah, these are definitely some of the very popular ways that are used to describe direct instruction often. In the literature, repetitive, traditional. Yeah, that's another term that's often used. Link learning and rationale for learning. Ooh, I like that. Feedback. Basic skills, foundational skills. Yeah. Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you. And keep adding if you want to. I'll take us back to our slides. And so, yeah, this is exactly what we wanted to see in terms of, what are some of the ways? It's not only the idea that what do you think it is, but it's like, what have you seen it described as? And that's really where we wanted to go with this discussion. Okay, so let's go back to my slides, or our slides. So here, what we have in front of us is an amazing summary that Paul Kirschner himself created. I think it was one of the presentations, and we were lucky enough to see that particular tweet, and we've been using it ever since, with all credit to Paul. He lists here some of the incorrect beliefs or stereotypes, I should say, of direct/explicit instruction versus what it really is versus a reality. So let's look at them. So in the incorrect or stereotypes, there's words like it's just drill and practice, or it's rote learning. It's only good for teaching facts and procedures. It's only good for teaching basic skills. And those words came. Boring came as well. All teacher directed, that direct instruction is just teacher led, teacher led, teacher led. That it's only for teaching basic skills in isolation from meaningful context. So all these, what direct instruction really is, are actually incorrect beliefs of that. And a lot of these are very popular. And no wonder many educators who may or may not know the unlayering of this particular phrase, direct instruction, the way Rosenshine has outlined it for us, may want to reject that. Of course, right? Like if you look at that list, it's like, you want to teach this way? And people would say, I don't think so. So, but what really is if you look on the right side of the screen now, it says it involves active learning. And this is something, if you remember from the agenda, the notion of active learning, we're going to touch upon it a little bit more. Jim's going to do that. Then it's actually really student friendly, because at the end of the day, who's learning is the students are, right? It's cognitively engaging because students have all these amazing opportunities to pause, independent practice, self-monitor, metacognitive sort of checks in there. It's really cognitively engaging for learners. It's also concerned with students developing really conceptual level understanding, and they have an opportunity to derive meaning from instruction, remember semantic processing, remember deep processing. It's designed that learners are actually able to do that. It's also developmentally appropriate, and it's tailored for students' learning needs because it takes into account prior knowledge, what they know, what they don't know. Students are really engaged as active participants. Again, it's not just this notion of teacher-led, but it's for the students. Students are at the center of it, and it can be used in diverse contexts and curricular areas. So this, I think, is a really amazing slide that Kirschner developed for us. And every now and then I pop it on my Twitter space or my LinkedIn, and creates an amazing array of discussions. And I'm really glad that we're able to share it here with you all. So let's continue looking at this further.
Yeah, one of the things we want to talk a little bit more about is this notion of active learning, because active learning in itself is often the source of a lot of misconceptions. Many people interpret active learning as meaning the same thing as being hands-on, but they're not really the same thing. Active learning doesn't really mean hands-on. It's probably better understood as being minds-on. So it doesn't require physical activity, but it does require mental activity that's focused on learning. Recently, we were looking at this really cool new course on Coursera. It's called Uncommon Sense Teaching. It's by doctors Barbara Oakley, Beth Rogoski, and Terence Sejnowski, and it's really quite good. And I just want to share a little piece of it with you. I've got a video here. It's called Is Your Lesson a Grecian Urn? How's that? Yeah, excellent. Thank you.
Remember Katina, our student who spent time studying but just could not seem to do well on the test? You might wonder whether there is a simple, scientifically validated way to increase Katina's understanding and her success. Research has shown that active learning seems to be the key. But is it really? Let's dig deeper to find out. First, though, let's make sure we're on the same page regarding the definition of the phrase active learning.
It's natural to think that active learning means that the students should be doing something active that is physical with the material. If you are teaching Greek culture and history, for example, you might have students build a papier-mâché Grecian urn. It's active and it has to do with Greek culture and history, so it works, right? Not quite. In fact, not even close. It turns out that hands-on doesn't necessarily mean minds-on. Jennifer Gonzalez of the blog The Cult of Pedagogy explains it best. Draping wet, gluey newspaper around a balloon has nothing to do with deepening one's understanding of societies and cultures. I've seen far too many Grecian urns, projects that look creative, that the teacher might describe as hands-on learning, interdisciplinary teaching, project-based instruction, or the integration of arts or technology, but that nonetheless lack any substantial learning for students. Jennifer goes on to note how time-consuming these kinds of projects can be, which means they leave less time for students to grapple with the more challenging stuff.
Jennifer has exactly the right idea. Let's go back to what's happening in the brain when we're learning. A very faint trace of neural links are laid when teachers first give students an explanation of something difficult, and students follow along. Now, can students lay these links by themselves? Yes, but not very easily if the material is difficult. For example, you try figuring out vector calculus, or the history of the Roman Empire, or how neurons signal one another all on your own. It's just not that simple. That's why we need teachers, and why some explicit instruction to the students helps them get started.
But most students can only listen for so long before they just can't take anymore, and they begin to either tune out or act out. Instead, they need you to hit that pause button to help them reinforce the faint links you've helped them to lay down. They reinforce those links with their own active retrieval efforts. We'll get to why that is later on. That's where active learning comes in. When students retrieve and work with those faint links of learning, perhaps by practicing with them on their own, or working collaboratively, or re-explaining the material to others, they begin strengthening those faint links. Most students can only tune in for a little while before their brains begin to wander off onto other thoughts, which tells us that long sessions of presentation or explicit instruction, say 5 minutes or more for elementary school students, or 20 minutes or more for high school and college students, just don't make for good teaching.
So what's often been suggested instead is to spend the entire period in active learning, like this. But we've just seen that students often need guidance as they are laying down the initial traces of learning. So maybe that means you want to intersperse explicit instruction. That is your expert, teacher-directed presentation with active learning, like this. Or maybe like this, with more active learning than teacher-directed explicit presentation. Or maybe even like this, with a fairly even mixture of active learning and teacher-directed explicit instruction. The truth is, these mixtures of active learning and teacher-directed explicit instruction are called direct instruction. Yes, direct instruction.
Okay, I'll stop it there.
I love that. Thank you, Jim. You can
Yeah.
stop sharing. I can go back to the slides. Perfect.
Okay.
That
Yeah.
was awesome.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a fun video. It does a kind of a good job of explaining the role that active learning can play in direct instruction.
Yeah.
So active learning, it's always nice to see Barbara Oakley. She's going to be at this conference that Nidhi's putting on in Toronto, and she's a terrific speaker.
She's amazing. Yes, she's coming, and yeah, if you're here, you'll meet her, and you'll see how just accessible and approachable and awesome she is, just like in the video, actually. Okay, Jim, would you like me to go to the next slide?
Um, yeah, sure. Let's go on to the next slide.
Yeah.
So,
Oh, I
yeah,
guess
so
this
that
is
was
yeah,
what we just saw. Yeah.
yeah.
So active learning is might be accompanied by some physical activity, but it doesn't have to be. So, for example, students might be using, say, physical manipulatives to solve math problems. But the important thing is that active learning does need this kind of minds-on um, focus to be active learning. Let's go on and talk a little bit about the history of direct instruction. Um, yeah, here we go. So direct instruction was developed, or at least his principles of instruction were developed by Barak Rosenshine. He developed these scientifically by drawing on three different literatures: literature on research on cognitive science, on research on master teachers. This was kind of interesting. These were a series of studies in which researchers would watch master teachers as they taught, and they try to figure out what are these people doing that makes them so effective. And then the third line of research that he was looking at was on cognitive supports. And Rosenshine discovered that the findings from these three literatures were largely consistent in terms of what they were recommending. And so he used these findings from all this research to create his principles of instruction. So you've been reviewing them a little bit this past week. And the principles actually bring together many of the concepts that we've touched on in this book series, including, the stuff we've looked on in terms of cognitive load and deep processing, dual coding, the importance of prior knowledge, are all kind of feed into the direct instruction model and Rosenshine's principles. Let's just go over them quickly one at a time. First is daily review. This is, again, the links to prior knowledge and advanced organizers that we talked about, and retrieval practice. This also incorporates spacing and cognitive load and interleaving. And all of these kinds of things strengthen prior knowledge and activate it for the current lesson. Next one, present material using small steps. Again, this has really nice ties to cognitive load theory and dual coding. It's all about working memory. Because working memory is limited in size, we have to present new material in small bits so we don't overwhelm or confuse students. And the presenting of new material is where dual coding can play a key role. So we want to present new material in small and easy to grasp steps, but also take into account both the visual and text-based nature of effective instruction. Asking question is important for retrieval practice, for formative assessment for teachers, for making sure students understand material in a deep way, activating prior knowledge. So all of this is about helping the teacher determine how well material has been learned, and detecting problems and bugs in students' thinking. Let's go on to the next one. Providing models was his fourth recommendation. Again, there are good connections here to cognitive load theory. If you've got a complex problem that you want students to solve, then giving them models or worked examples can offload some of the complexity. This reduces the strain on working memory, and it's particularly important in fields like math and science, where these worked examples become really helpful for students. Guiding student practice is important because new materials can be quickly forgotten unless students are given a chance to practice them, to elaborate, to work on them further. This is the active learning part that Barbara was just talking about. This is where we reinforce those mental connections that were initially set down when we presented materials to the students. Checking for understanding, this resonates with formative assessment. Effective teachers frequently check to make sure that all students are learning the new material. It's a place where teachers can identify and correct misunderstandings. Obtaining a high success rate is really cool because for motivation. And some of the people, and you might have read this in the book, Rosenshine is looking for a high success rate of around 80%. And if you can get about 80% of your students succeeding when they first try something, it's a good indicator that they understand the material, and having a high success rate also positively affects student motivation. It means they feel confident about their own success, they've developed more self-efficacy, and they're more willing to try again when they're challenged with new material. Next one is on providing scaffolds for difficult tasks. And again, if you provide scaffolds, this helps students, this reduces the strain on working memory, and allows them to complete a difficult task the first time with a bit of assistance. And then on subsequent tries, you start removing the scaffolds so that students can master it on their own. And then the next one is weekly and monthly review. Oh, sorry, independent practice. This is the goal state. This is where you want to get to. You want to eventually get to the place where students can accomplish something on their own. And you do this by through repeated independent practice. And then finally, weekly and monthly review. This is where we get into things like spaced practice and retrieval practice. Again, we saw from our previous workshops that if you use spaced practice, that it deepens those mental traces, and it makes them more persistent and makes it less likely they're going to forget material over the long period. So yeah, those 10 items really nicely kind of connect to a lot of the literature that's shown, the benefits of retrieval practice, spacing, interleaving, cognitive load theory, growth mindset, metacognition. These things all interact really nicely with this really solid academic literature. This visual was created by Bradley Bush at Inner Drive. It's really nice, a great blog, a lot of great content there to read and apply. Last thing I want to mention is just to be a little bit careful. Rosenshine's 10 principles are intended to be used intelligently and strategically by instructors. They're intended to be guidelines. And in How Learning Happens, the new version of Paul Kirschner's book, he talks about instances where school boards or teacher trainers have turned Rosenshine's principles into checklists where teachers are expected to build on, to check off to make sure they've done each one of these 10. And that's not how they should be used. This is what Kirschner and Hendrick refer to as a lethal mutation. So a lethal mutation is like a good evidence-backed idea that's been misinterpreted or misapplied. That's not how things should actually be done.
Great, thank you for mentioning that. And this is just a very, very new component that we started mentioning also because it's mentioned in the latest edition of the book as well. And this is true. If you remember that video that we just watched about active learning and teacher-led sort of explanation, there were different ways where the presenter on the screen was saying, you could do it this way, or you could do it this way, you could do it this way. It's not about, I did this, now I'm going to do that. There's a lot of this pedagogical expertise, and I actually like to call it pedagogical magic, and there's a lot of thinking behind it that needs to be taking place. So extremely important to think about. So thank you, Jim. Thanks for that overview. Okay, there were some questions. I think Catherine had a question, but we'll get back to that question at the end of the slides, if that's okay, Catherine. But what we'll continue on is talk a little bit about project follow-through. And it connects really nicely to the discussion on direct instruction and the principles that Rosenshine has given. Before I get into project follow through, I want to say one more thing. If you remember the terms, the phrases that Rosenshine used, daily review, check for understanding, independent practice, provide scaffolds. I say this to Jim so many times, and I'll say it again, and we both agree to this idea, is that he could not have said it in any simpler words. It's just so amazing. And that's what we educators, if we can think about that as we are designing our instruction, presenting it, or implementing that and executing that in a session, I think it's really amazing. I've read somewhere they're also called 10 golden principles of instruction. I think I just get goosebumps talking about them, but I just want to share that passion with you all as well. And with that, I'll continue and talk about the story of Project Follow Through. If you already know about it, here's a recap. If you don't know about it, get ready to be shocked, surprised, and amazed. All right. So the last thing we want to talk about in our book study is Project Follow Through. Project Follow Through is actually discussed in chapter 18 of the text that we're looking at, and it's not maybe there's some detail in it, but we want to tell a little bit more about it. So just unfold the story. So the story of Project Follow Through is a fascinating story of an educational research project. Follow Through was the biggest government-funded educational research ever conducted. I'll say that again, biggest government-funded educational research project ever conducted. It was focused in promoting equity and supporting early years learning in disadvantaged communities. One of the interesting things about Project Follow Through is that very few teachers know about it. Again, you very rarely hear about it in teacher education programs, with the exception if you took mine and Jim's course now at OEZ, I have to say. However, it is very, very important for two reasons. First, it's a wonderful large-scale study of the effects of a special version of direct instruction, the one with the D uppercase and I uppercase, developed back in the 1970s. And second, it also illustrates a really interesting tension that exists in education today. And the tension is illustrated in the two tweets that I'm just about to show you. And Jim and I saw it back in 2022, and here they are. So I'll read the tweets to you. Or actually, I'll give you a second to read the two tweets. So if you've had a chance to read the tweet, here's the tension. How do we make decisions on how to teach, right? The first person here, whose name is hidden, feels that teachers should choose an educational philosophy that they like and use that as a foundation for their teaching. This person feels that different teachers choose different philosophies and they make educational decisions based on how well they align with their personal philosophy. But Carl's view, Carl Hendrick's name's not hidden, Carl's view is a little bit different. He feels that science and research should guide how we teach, rather some philosophy that you have adopted, right? Now, this kind of discussion or this tweet, and there's continued on, I'm pretty sure on Twitter or X, this nicely captures the two very different ways of teaching. First, on the one hand, there is a belief that as a teacher, I should be able to invent my own philosophy of education, and my teaching should be guided by that. On the other hand, there's a sense that my teaching should be guided by science and evidence rather than intuitions and personal beliefs. Now, some elements of this conflict show up in Project Follow Through as well, and that's what we want to talk about. Okay, so going back to Project Follow Through. Project Follow Through was the biggest and the most expensive educational research project ever funded by the United States government. It was massive. Over 70,000 children in 180 disadvantaged communities. That's how big it was. $1 billion of funding back in 1960s. I don't know exactly, but I think it may be equivalent to about $9 trillion or something today. Regardless, lots of zeros, lots of money. Project Follow Through was a project aimed at promoting equity. It was created in the 1960s by President Lyndon Johnson as part of his war on poverty. It was concerned with helping disadvantaged kids. The goal of the project was to answer this one question that I'm just about to show you. What is the best way to teach disadvantaged children from kindergarten to grade 3 so they don't fall behind other students? one question. That's what they wanted to know. So this is how they designed the research. I'm going to walk you through it. Top educational researchers from all across the United States were invited to tackle the question about how to help disadvantaged children's success in the early primary grades. All the best minds of the best universities were invited to participate. Educational scholars from across the United States all proposed instructional models that they thought could or would help struggling kids. I think there were 22 different models of instruction that were put forward. Each one of these models was tested in a variety of schools over 10 years, over a 10-year period. A 10-year period was chosen because they wanted to make sure that teachers had plenty of time to learn and properly implement each model of instruction. Everyone in the school had to buy into this particular educational model that they would choose. There were control groups for each model. A wide range of communities were selected for test sites, spanning all the demographic variables, ethnic compositions, and poverty levels. The goal was to figure out which of these 22 models worked the best. Each year, data were collected on 10,000 students in these 22 different models to measure student achievement in basic skills, cognitive skills, and self-esteem. 2 independent agencies were recruited to collect and analyze all the data. To the best of our knowledge, no one has ever questioned the data collection or data analysis for Project Follow Through. All of that was done very, very professionally and carefully. The 22 models were based on different philosophies of teaching. I showed you 2 earlier that were in the tweet. Here are some of the models that were tested. So we'll show you some popular ones. The first one was the open educational model, which is it builds a child's responsibility for their own learning, reading, and writing focused. The second was developmentally appropriate practices. This is where children are encouraged to schedule their own activities, make plans, and they can choose whom to work with. The teacher provides choices in ways that foster development of positive self-concept. And then there's, of course, the whole language, needs not much introduction, but the idea is teachers elaborate on child's present experiences and interest to teach intellectual processes such as recalling, comparing, relationships. Child-directed choices are very, very important in this particular model, and content is less important. Constructivist or discovery learning. This is, again, needs not much introduction, but very child-centered. Child's interest guides what they want to do, what they want to work on. And the idea is that student would discover new knowledge for themselves. And it emphasizes on things like building critical thinking skills and problem thinking skills as well. And last but not the least is direct instruction. Now, I just want to mention here, the version of direct instruction that was tested in Project Follow Through is not the same as what we just looked at, the Rosenshine's direct instruction. That's the lowercase di. This was the uppercase di. It was developed by Siegfried Engelmann. But again, it did overlap in a lot of ways. But this version of direct instruction that was in Project Follow Through was a lot more intense and more scripted and included a complete curriculum of exactly what each student would learn each day. So you can see it's a science-based teacher-directed model targeting basic knowledge and foundational skills. I think a lot of the definitions that are used to describe the current DI, Rosenshine's DI, people have remembered the terms that you also shared that in the Padlet as well. So these were the 5 more common ones, but there's so many more. So now, Jim, over to you. You're muted.
Great. Thanks, Nidhi. I
No
noticed
worries.
Paul's here, so I'm going to just finish this off kind of quickly here. So yeah, they were measured on a lot of these different items on math and language skills, problem-solving skills, self-esteem. They gave the schools about 10 years to make sure they were implementing all the models correctly. There were a lot of excitement about the results because nobody was quite sure what was going to happen. A lot of people at the time were of the opinion that all the projects would be effective because they'd all provided their own control classroom and they all had some kind of invested interest in succeeding. So they all thought that all of the experimental classrooms would probably do better than the control classrooms, but they were wrong. And the results were actually quite a huge surprise to everyone. So it turned out that direct instruction model did best on all of these variables. It did better in terms of fostering math and language skills. It did better in terms of fostering problem solving and cognitive skills. And the students who took this also had higher levels of self-esteem. Like, even though self-esteem and problem solving weren't something that they were explicitly trying to teach or foster, it did better. And the students had higher self-esteem because they could see themselves succeeding. They could see themselves doing well. Yeah, and so this is a kind of an interesting graph. It shows here at the 20 percentile because 20 percentile is kind of the stage at which the lower achieving students were thought to be a kind of a baseline for it. But the direct instruction condition was succeeding compared to all the other models. It was really quite extraordinary. Unfortunately, this didn't really have any kind of long-term effects. The direct instruction model was associated largely with behaviorist learning theory at the time. We now know that a lot of the stuff that Ziegelman was doing was in fact highly consistent with what research has shown us to be effective. You know, but at the time it was kind of derided as being a behaviorist approach. People didn't like it. It wasn't exciting. Everybody at the time was into inquiry-based learning and students directing their own learning and open classrooms and whole language learning and self-esteem. These kinds of models were appealing to researchers at the time because they fit their beliefs and personal philosophies of what learning should be like. And the science of project follow-through was not going to change their opinion. And researchers at the time had huge NSF grants to study things like discovery learning and whole language learning. So the results turned out to be a huge inconvenience and embarrassment for the educational establishment. And so what happened was, rather than expanding direct instruction, it was decided instead to give some of the losing projects funding to see if they could be improved. That was kind of their solution at the time. And over time, project follow-through was just largely forgotten. But anyways, we just wanted to kind of share it with you because it's quite an amazing story. Nidhi. Oh,
Yeah, yes, of course. Yeah, so cool story, amazing story, but also quite sad because you can see that in Project Follow Through how education is often not driven by science. Education is often driven by philosophy and ideologies, which is where I started this discussion with these two tweets, right? Like last week we talked about learning styles and we learned there's no evidence for learning styles, yet they're still taught and we're using that in government issued documents that are seen as the guiding principle documents for teachers, continues to promote learning styles, and teachers still believe in learning styles. And it's not their own fault or anything. It's just that how is information presented, right? And to what extent? And again, brings us back to these tweets that teachers are guided by their personal philosophies and not by science. And despite having such an amazing story with such large data, it was just hidden, and just because, as Jim said, it was a big embarrassment. And I put in the chat as well as like evidence hurts ideologies. And so we sometimes don't want to talk about it. Okay, I think I'll just talk really quickly about this particular slide, and we're pretty much at the end of it, and Paul's here too. So one of the things you need to know about direct instruction is that when people run large-scale comparisons between direct instruction and other types of learning, the more romantic names like discovery learning or inquiry-based learning or problem-based learning or whatever, it's a direct instruction that usually proves itself to be superior and better learning outcomes are seen. Direct instruction also tends to reduce inequities, while inquiry-based methods like discovery learning tend to increase these inequities. Direct instruction is beneficial for kids who are struggling. And here's the study that you see on your screen right now, and we thought we'll just briefly share. This chart is from tests in PISA, which is the Program for International Student Assessment, PISA. which does large-scale international analyses of student performance. And we saw it recently, and we thought it might be fun to share. So if you look at the data collected across dozens of countries here, you'll see that countries that do a lot of inquiry-based learning generally perform poorly on international tests of achievement. The red bubbles below baseline, while the aqua-colored bubbles present the above baseline. In countries that use teacher-directed methods tend to do better on the PISA assessments. And countries that use inquiry-based tend to do worse. So you can see here that there is a sweet spot somewhere. You know, you get the best outcomes if you do teacher-directed instruction in many to all the lessons, and do inquiry-based approaches in some, ideally when some level of mastery has reached or the prior knowledge gaps have been fulfilled, right? Anyway, exciting content again, and hopefully you'll continue to remain inspired and want to learn more about it and continue to do that. And that actually brings us to the end of this book study. Thank you. If you want to stay connected, you see our LinkedIn spaces and connect with us on X if you'd like. And yeah, that's it. And I'm going to stop sharing because I know Paul's here. Welcome, Paul. Thank you for joining again.
Thank you. Really nice. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. If I could, although almost everyone in the world uses the term direct instruction, and when you're speaking about it, you can't see if it's an uppercase or a lowercase D and I. John Sweller and I, since 2006, prefer the term explicit instruction. And actually, that's the term that Barak, someone reminded me that I was in a panel with Barak a number of years ago while it was incredible while he was still alive. I had forgotten that we were in that panel together, which led to the book by Sig Tobias and Tom Duffy over instructivist versus constructivist learning or teaching. But he actually used the term explicit instruction originally, and it was changed in the American Educator article, I think. They might have first used the term direct instruction. But he was speaking, if you look at what he's, in the UNESCO report, the 17 principles that he had,
Yeah.
as you said very, very astutely, are kind of like the simplest way you can say things. You know, like check for achievement, you know, those types of things. You know, you can't say it any more succinctly. In that it's principles for explicitly instructing the students. And direct is more from Sig Engelman, and that's a specifically, as you said, scripted approach to teaching, which I could never do. But I'm not here to give a lecture. I'm here to answer questions about today or anything else with the book. So that's kind of like open the floor and or open the screen and ask anything you want.
Oh, we have a good question from Paul. It says, what advice would you give to a teacher wanting to start teaching more explicitly? What is an easy starting point?
Easiest starting point is going to the American Educator article from American Federation of Teachers, in which Barak, there's two things. Number one, he really explains what explicit instruction is. And number two, gives, at that point in time, all of the references to help you understand why that's the case. You have to realize Barak was an incredible man. He studied, he presented his 10 principles or 17 principles based upon cognitive psychology, empirical research, and teacher effectiveness studies. In that respect, Barak was a polymath. He didn't approach it just from one point of view. So what he tells you in his 10 or 17 principles, whichever one you would, and just download both of them, I would say. He gives you what makes an effective teacher, and I think that's what a beginning teacher wants to be. He tells why that's the case from a cognitive psychological point of view, and he looks at the research as to whether or not it works. And for me, those are three, unbearable, prerequisites of what every teacher should have. Not only what to do, but why and how. Okay, that's my answer.
Thank you. And then thank you, Matthias, for sharing all these amazing resources in the chat as well. So the 17 Principles article Matthias shared, the 10 Principles also, and there's a few more resources that have come
They're
in.
all open. Those are in any event all accessible on the web.
Yeah.
Everything from AFT is open access.
Yeah. That's why whenever I'm teaching, Paul, I like to explain, I would say explicit instruction, direct instruction, write it, and then I say Rosenshine's principles of instruction, because for me it's like goes back to just this idea of principles. When you put the word principles, then it also takes care of, because Jim and I were talking about just probably when you joined in, this notion of lethal mutation, that don't use these as a checklist. So when you say principles, it's not just that you do it step 1, step 2, step 3. It's like a lot of thinking involved in there. So I prefer to call that. And I want to also mention one more thing. You mentioned Barack Rosenshine was an incredible man. It's so true. There was this one video at a conference, I think sometime in 2002. And at some point, Rosenshine just standing and saying, smiling, and saying, you need background knowledge. We need background knowledge to construct meaning. And then he laughs and it's like, so therefore, the more background knowledge you have, the better meaning you can construct. And it's just, sometimes I just wake up thinking about it and just smiling. I'm like, such a simple idea, but so powerful. It changes the way we teach.
It's not a question, and I often begin my presentations on this. It's, for me, not a question of telling you or knowing what you should do. It's important to know why that's the case, because only if you have that knowledge can you be an actual reflective practitioner. And that's what you want to achieve with teachers. You want them to be reflective practitioners.
Thank you.
Donald Schoen. Matthias in the background will now give you a reference to reflective practitioners from okay.
Are there any other questions, or if something I've missed in the chat, this might be a time you can probably just unmute and share the question yourself.
Hi, this is Katia. I wanted to, I did write a note to Nidhi regarding engagement and all of the principles we have seen so far. And I know we need to have like a balance between all these techniques and the engagement. And I wanted to ask you, what do you think goes to achieve both the learning objective and the engagement objective?
The most important thing about this, thank you very much for the question. The most important thing when you're speaking of engagement, and you can look at the inaugural address of Professor Robert Coe in England, is that engagement itself is a very poor proxy for learning. What you need to do is get people to be cognitively engaged in what they're doing. So, I mean, it's really great if you see kids talking to each other and working with each other and joking with each other and looking like they're really having a lot of fun and engaged with what they're doing. But if they're not cognitively engaged with what they're doing, they won't learn. I often give the example of a bunch of, let's say, a team of children working on a project about volcanoes and volcanism. And they make this incredibly beautiful volcano from paper mache, and they've colored it, and they've painted it, and they have this bottle in it, which you can't see. And while you're not, when they come and show it, it's full of Coca-Cola. And all of a sudden they put a mint or two in, and it starts bubbling, and it comes out, and they've done this, and they've spent 3 weeks, maybe 8 or 10 or 12 hours really working on it. And it's beautiful, and they've been engaged in an incredible way, making this beautiful thing. But if you then ask them afterwards could you please now explain the plate tectonics of a volcano? Or What is it with the magma and the magma pressure that leads it to erupt? And why do you sometimes only see gases coming out of it? And why does it sometimes erupt and disrupt the whole cities and countries? They probably won't be able to give you an answer because they've been engaged, but not cognitively engaged. They haven't been busy with understanding the ideas behind volcanoes, volcanism, plate tectonics, and those plate movement and those types of things. So while I completely agree, engagement, motivation, all of those things are important. If you're not cognitively engaged, then yeah, you've made a really nice paper mache volcano.
Yeah, that message is loud and clear. So the next question is how to achieve cognitive engagement.
Oh, well, there are a number of ways. I mean, the easiest way to do it is what you might call generative learning activities from Logan Fiorella and Rich Mayer. Those are 8 engaging approaches. My Flemish colleagues use the term herkneden, kneading with the letter Kneading. What you do is you stimulate your students, your pupils, to engage with the materials and transform it into something else, like transforming what I'm saying now into a diagram, or summarizing it, or doing those types of things. And you can include activities that you might find fun in it, but the goal is not for it to be fun. The goal is it to be cognitively engaging. And they give 8 different, those two give 8 different approaches to generative learning that a student can use. And I'd say, look at that and then understand it, and then think about how you can implement it in your classroom in a way that students like to do it. But the idea is those 8, and Gavin Brud has also a number which sometimes overlap with Rich and Logan and sometimes don't. And you can look at those two, Gavin Brud and Logan Fiorella and Rich Mayer, on generative learning activities. By the way, die van Brood is really good because it also explains what works for what things in what age groups. So that's also an important part of it, because all of those generative activities that they all give, those are all skills. And teachers often expect or think that the students will have the skills that they're expecting of them, but skills need to be explicitly, going back to Barry Rosenshine, explicitly instructed, practiced, and given feedback. And if you don't do that, then actually absurd to try to implement. I did a piece of research with a PhD student, or I should better say, my PhD student did a piece of research with me. And one of the things was to see whether summarizing was better than retrieval practice. And we thought it would be, because we thought, wow, you ask someone to retrieve from their long-term memory something and paraphrase it, put it in their own words. And that should be at least as good, if not better, than retrieval practice that we've stimulated. And it wasn't. And I said to her, what you need to do, Kim, is look at the summaries. And these were children in grade 11 in an academic high school. And their summaries were horrific. And then, of course, if that's the case, then of course summarizing doesn't work. Because if you can't make a summary, it won't work. If you can't ride a bicycle, you can't bike up a hill. Okay.
I just wanted to mention one more thought, and that was a really great question from Katya. And Katya, I did respond earlier this morning, so maybe you haven't seen that. But the other piece in this is that I think there is this automatic expectation that children are supposed to have fun in classrooms, and it should be always happy and stuff. And I think Dylan William has said it somewhere, you know, education is hard. That's why we need to teach it or something in those words.
Yeah.
So I think setting a realistic expectation, nothing wrong with having fun. And I think fun is amazing. Fun is awesome. Like I walk by my kids at school and I see them during recess and they're like screaming, running on play structures. But when it comes to them sitting down and learning to read A, B, and or making sounds or at a rat or whatever, I think there is a certain sense of like, okay, there now you got to cognitively engage yourself, because just jumping and running is not actually going to teach how to do that. I think that discussion is also really important to be had, because when people expect I'm just going to do fun, or that's why I'm going to school, that may not align with how explicit instruction should be.
Yeah, if
It's
we look
hard
back
work.
at Project Follow Through, and Jim made a really good point about that with self-esteem, and that being successful gives a child self-esteem. Being successful motivates a person to continue what they're doing. If you are practicing football, soccer, and you constantly with those dummies in front of you, I'm not talking about the other team, I'm talking about literal dummies, you kick the ball and kick the ball and kick the ball, and it constantly hits the dummies or goes 7 meters wide or above the goal, you'll eventually get the idea, I can't take free kicks. If you have a good coach, a good trainer, who shows you how to stand, how to place your leg, what part of your foot you should use to get a curl into it, and you see that work, all of a sudden you're motivated to continue. You don't have this idea of, well, I'll let someone else take the free kicks. You have this idea, hey, I can curl the ball. How can I curl it then better? Hey, coach, this is working, but how do I also get it to drop down? That type of thing. It's people underestimate the value and the drive that success gives a child that at the beginning thinks I can't do it, and at the end sees the sheer he can do it. That's incredibly motivating. That's incredible for the engagement.
Yes.
And your job as a teacher is to let or help the children achieve success so that they enjoy studying, that it doesn't become or enjoy learning, so that it doesn't become a horrific chore, which they'll probably fail at, but it becomes an enjoyable experience that they're successful at. And that's with writing or reading or math or playing soccer or whatever. It doesn't matter. Success breeds motivation. Motivation does not lead to success. It can only get you started on something. But if you fail, you become demotivated. And that's what we should be achieving in school. Not fun, but fulfillment, achievement, a feeling of self-esteem that I can do it. Those are the things we need to achieve. I'll get off of my preaching stool at the chair at the moment.
That was awesome. Thank you. That was great. I was kind of writing it up as well, just in alignment to it, some of the principles. I think, Karen, you had a question earlier. You want to ask it? Is Karen still here? Oh, yes.
I'm just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about elaboration as a practice, because I keep hearing it referred to or seeing it referred to in things that I'm reading, but I've yet to find something that really kind of spells out exactly what the practice of elaboration is, mostly just on account of time, but I figure you probably have a great notion about that.
Yeah, well, elaboration, very good. Well, there are two types of elaboration. First, there's elaboration in terms of elaboration theory with Charlie Reigeleth, which is about how you set up and sequence a curriculum. He likens it to zooming in as opposed to cutting in a film. If you cut from one place to another, it's completely different than if you zoom in and zoom out. And for him is elaboration, zooming in on something and then zooming out, going down, starting at the zoom out, at the whole picture, then zooming in on one aspect, understanding it, realizing what it has to do with that broader concept, and then zooming out. That's one form of elaboration, elaboration theory. The other type of elaboration as a generative learning activity And I would say, well, look at what Logan Fiorella and Rich Mayer say about it. But the essence of it is, of elaboration, is thinking more deeply about something that you're reading or trying to understand. So delving in more deeply, thinking about why is this the case? Not just taking it at face value, looking for examples from other fields, other areas of that general concept, those types of things. And as a teacher, you can do that. You could say like elaboration. One of the most famous, it has nothing to do with elaboration, but one of the most famous, now interesting studies that I know of that gives you a good idea of it is a study of, you give people to try to transfer what they've learned to another area. And they have just learned a story of how spreading out your forces across a number of different entry routes into a city will lead to taking over the city, yeah, as a general. So like splitting it up into smaller groups and attacking from all sides. And what they tried to do in that experiment is see whether people would make use of that to understand the giving of radiation therapy in cancer. Because you know, if you bombard with an incredible amount of radiation, you'll not only kill the tumor, but also quite a lot of healthy tissue around it. And the idea was to see whether or not they could make use of the transfer, the idea of splitting it up into smaller groups, into let's irradiate it from different angles with a smaller radiation dose to kill the tumor and not to kill the healthy tissue. And the students couldn't do that. Now, if you take that, and I understand it might be quite a lot of cognitive load at the moment that I'm saying what I'm saying to you, as a teacher, it's not in just giving them that idea from warfare and expecting them to be able to do it, but elaboration is, how could you make use of that principle if you're trying to do this and that? Think more deeply about it. What is the equivalent of splitting up your troops if we're talking about radiation therapy, or if we're talking about dose-response relationships with a medicine or whatever, those types of things. Now, this is a very specific case, but it's a way of helping your students to think about it so that eventually they themselves will begin to elaborate on what they're learning and thinking what it means in this situation, in other situations, what other things that they've learned relate to what they're learning at this moment. That is, in a lot of words, elaboration.
So it's a practice that you would use toward the end of the instructional hierarchy once kids have their accuracy and fluency, or is it something that you would also maybe do as part of your I do when you're modeling?
You could do it as in an I do, we do, they do. You could do it that way. The most important thing is they need the knowledge in order to do it. So you can't start that way. You can't start with elaborating on something that you don't know or don't understand. So it's important in any event, in small steps, principle 2 from Baruch Rosenshine, to teach it to them. But from that point on, when you're sure that they understand it, then you can ask them to elaborate upon that and how that might work. And that can be everything from pasteurization of milk to volcanoes or whatever, to elaborate on it. But you have to understand the concept itself, have the knowledge in order to elaborate upon it.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome,
Thank you,
Karen.
Karen. Oh, this is fantastic. Thank you, folks. I'm looking at the time as well. I think there was this one thought in there, which I'll just quickly mention, then we'll call it at that point, and then I'm just going to share something about research real briefly. But someone said that, there's an attendance issue in secondary schools, and you can't help wonder that teachers focus on explicit instruction that can really help. But the issue is really getting teachers on board with explicit instruction in secondary. So I was just saying that I think it's got to start with like unpacking what explicit instruction really is, because it's so misunderstood. And we started off with your slide, by the way, that you'd used many years ago, stereotypes, disbeliefs. So we've already done that, Paul. So just so you know, but I think that discussion should precede any other discussion before we say do it. It's like there's a false understanding, there's misconceptions floating around, and I think a lot of it has got to do with the terminology. And I think just
I wrote a blog
unpacking
about
is
that,
important.
and I can't give you the URL, but if you Google Paul Kirschner and Rodney Dangerfield, you'll find the blog on why nobody likes explicit instruction. I'm old enough to know who Rodney Dangerfield was, and he always started his jokes with, "I get no respect."
I also do say, Paul, that I think folks in the cognitive science space weren't very creative with the terminology, because we're competing with like discovery learning. It's like, I imagine a Lonely Planet, or things like inquiry based or thinking classrooms. It's like we had to be a little bit. So I'm glad that Virtual Practice has managed to make the mark, move away from practice testing. I think we just need to be a little bit more cooler with our terminology. Sexy.
Okay, everybody, I'm now going to split. This was the last session.
Yes,
so
but we'll see you on May 4th. We'll see you on May 4th. I'm just about to share the link to all the speakers and session titles at a glance. This is just something I put together, but thank you, Paul, as I said last time, for making our...
Thank you, Jim, Nidhi, for what you've done. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye. Thank you, folks. And thanks, MJ, and thanks ONlit, Alicia, Una, who are not here right now, but please pass on these great, messages filled with gratitude to them for running this book study and recording these sessions, because I know a lot more people are viewing it, because I sometimes see how many views were there. They're really popular, and I get lots of messages, emails. Katya had emailed me as well, and it's just been really, really fascinating and phenomenal. So thank you, and thanks to Jim for being an amazing team teacher, amazing partner, my awesome colleague. This is just great. And I think I'm going to see many of you at Research Ed on May 3rd and 4th. Matthias is going to be there. Paul mentioned he's going to be there. Paul Kirschner will be joining in live again from the Netherlands during a session that Carl Hendrick is going to be running. I had hoped that Carl Hendrick will join this morning as well, but it's his birthday, and his girls had surprised him to take him to Legoland. So he said, Nidhi, I'm so sorry, I can't probably log in from there. It might be very loud. But for those who are coming to Research Ed, we'll have a chance to meet Carl Hendrick in person, and Paul will be joining in online. So yes, it's exciting. I'm really, really looking forward to Research Ed. And this has been a fascinating book study for me and Jim. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you all. It's been wonderful. Wonderful to meet you guys too. Yeah.
Yeah. And keep the passion going for our teaching. Yay.
Yeah.
We got to keep it. Yeah. For our learners, for our younger ones. So thank you. Thanks, everyone. Stay well, be well, and see some of you on May 3rd and 4th. Yay.
Great. Yeah.
Stay safe. Bye. Thanks,
Bye,
Jim.
everyone.